Hello my dear students, my name is Triratna Moktan. I am a teacher for life science at St. Robert's Higher Secondary School, and in this lesson we will be discussing the first chapter in life sciences for Madhyamik students. The first chapter is Control and Coordination in Living Organisms, and this chapter is divided into 5 parts. However, in this lesson we will be discussing the first part, which is sensitivity and response in plants. So to begin, we must first start by identifying one of the main characteristics of living organisms. One of the main characteristics of living organisms is their ability to respond to different types of stimuli, which means to generate a response to any given stimulus in the environment. Now you must be wondering, what is a stimulus and what is a response? So a stimulus, or in plural stimuli, can be any change in the internal or external environment that generates or evokes a response in the living organisms. Which means to say that any change, whether it is inside the organism or on the outside, which makes the organism react to that particular stimulus, then that change is known as a stimulus. And a response is any reaction of that particular living organism to that or to a given stimulus is known as the response. So if there is a stimulus, the organism will respond to the stimulus by generating a response. But however, in order for the organism to generate a response to that given stimulus, there has to be sensitivity, meaning to say that the living organism must be sensitive to that given stimulus. So, sensitivity is the ability of a living organism to detect and respond to a given stimulus. So here we have discussed 3 concepts: stimulus, response, and sensitivity. Now again, in order to generate a response to any given stimulus, the organism first must be sensitive to that stimulus, and then only it can generate a response. Now moving on, we have to talk about sensitivity and response in plants, which is the first part of the chapter. Now, before we move on to the next slide, there are certain concepts that I need to explain to you. So the first is now, plants, since they do not have sense organs like animals, they have other parts called perceptive regions, which are able to sense the different types of stimuli in the environment. And with the help of these perceptive regions, they sense the stimuli. Now once they sense the stimuli, and if they are sensitive to that particular stimuli, they will have to generate a response, and that response is generated from other parts of the plants known as responsive regions, which, as I have already told you, generate a response. So what we've learned up till now is that a stimulus is produced in the environment, or there are different types of stimuli present in the environment, which are first sensed by perceptive regions. The perceptive regions, once the plant is sensitive to those stimuli, the perceptive regions will pass on the stimulus to the responsive region, and the responsive region will generate a response which has to be visible. Now, with regard to this, there are 2 concepts that we first need to know, that is transmission time. Now what is transmission time? Transmission time is the time taken to transfer the stimulus from the perceptive region to the responsive region. So the time taken for the stimulus to go from the perceptive region to the responsive region is known as transmission time, whereas reaction or latent time is the time period between the application of stimulus to the generation of visible response. So, from the production of the stimulus to the generation of visible response, the time taken is known as reaction or latent time. So these are two very, very simple concepts that are associated with stimulus and response. Now moving forward, you can see in this diagram that this plant, which has been kept in darkness with only one source of light, which is this torch light, you can see that the plant seems to be bending towards the light. Now in this case, the stimulus is the light that is coming from the source, the only source, and the response, the plant responds by growing or moving, first moving towards the source, but eventually they will grow towards the plant, towards the source of light. Now moving forward, we have to discuss a very important person with regard to sensitivity in plants. The person that we are going to discuss is Acharya Jagadistan Bose. He was responsible for discovering sensitivity in plants, or he was the first person to say that through his experiments, he was the first person to discover that plants were also sensitive to different types of stimuli. And he discovered sensitivity in plants using two plants, which are the two plants Acharya Jagadistan Bose used were Mimosa pudica and Desmodium. Now both of these two plants show a response when they are stimulated by touch. So by experimenting on these two plants, Acharya Jagadistan Bose found out that plants were also sensitive to different types of stimulus like animals. Moving on, so here is a picture of Mimosa pudica. Moving on, we have to discuss now movement in plants. Now we are going to discuss movement in plants. But before we do that, we have to know that plants, when they generate a response to a given stimulus, their response most of the time will be in the form of movement. So therefore, in most plants, response to stimuli is expressed in the form of movement. However, the movement in plants is very slow and rapid movements are very, very rare. We saw two instances earlier where rapid movements were exhibited by the plants, which were Mimosa pudica and Desmodium. These were the two plants that we discussed earlier that show a response in the form of rapid movement, and they are very, very rare. Only a few plants can exhibit rapid movements. However, in most plants generally, the movement is very, very slow. Now, when we talk about movement, we must discuss two types of movements. The first type is movement of locomotion. Now, locomotion itself refers to a certain body moving from one place to another, where their entire bodily position changes. So therefore, movement of locomotion is a type of movement where the whole organism changes its bodily position. It moves from one place to another by changing its bodily position. The other type of movement is movement of curvature. Now, movement of curvature is also a movement, but however, the body of the organism remains fixed in one place and only its body parts or organs will move, which means to say that the bodily position of the organism does not change. So therefore, movement of curvature is the type of movement where the body of the organism remains fixed and only the body parts or organs will move. So here we have established that plants do not exhibit or show movement of locomotion. They only exhibit movement of curvature. Now, which means to say that plants, although they respond by moving, they do not change their bodily position. Their body remains fixed in one place. Only the different body parts, which are the different branches or different leaves, will only move in response to different types of stimuli. Now, in life sciences, there are always exceptions to different types of rules. So similarly, the rule that we established earlier was that plants do not show movement of locomotion, they only show movement of curvature. However, you will also find certain plants which are exceptions to that rule. These exceptions are Chlamydomonas, Volvox and Oscillatoria, all of which are belong to a group of plants known as algae. Now, as you may see, these are all printed here, or given here in italics, which means to say that these are all scientific names, and when you write it down, you have to underline them. So here you can see a picture of Chlamydomonas. It is a unicellular algae, and it has these two tail-like structures known as flagella. With the help of these flagella, it moves from one place to another. Although it is a plant, it shows movement of locomotion. It does not show movement of curvature. Here is a picture of Volvox. Now, Volvox, although it is a unicellular organism, it lives in a colony. You can see numerous cells that are grouped together. They live in a colony, and when they move, this whole colony moves from one place to another, which means to say that these individual cells also move from one place to another, showing or exhibiting movement of locomotion and not exhibiting movement of curvature. And the third and last exception is Oscillatoria. Now, these are also unicellular cyanobacteria, which are a type of algae, but they are present in this filamentous form, which are present in these filamentous structures. Oscillatoria also exhibit movement of locomotion, not movement of curvature. So these are the three exceptions. Now, my dear students, we will be discussing the different types of movements shown or exhibited by plants as a form of response to different types of stimuli. Now, these different types of movements are based on the relationship between the stimulus and the response. The first type of movement that we are going to discuss is tactic movement. Now, tactic movement is a movement of locomotion, which means to say that the plants that exhibit tactic movement, when they respond to a given stimulus, they change their entire bodily position. That means when they move from one place to another, they take their whole body with them. Now, what type of plants exhibit tactic movement? The plants that exhibit tactic movement are Chlamydomonas, Volvox and Oscillatoria. Now, these are plants that we have already discussed earlier, and I have told you that they belong to a group of plants known as algae. Now, what are the different types of tactic movements? Here we are going to discuss three types. The first being phototactic movement. Photo meaning light, so phototactic movement is a tactic movement shown as a response by plants to light. So when they respond to light, that is known as phototactic movement, the tactic movement in response to light. As an example, Chlamydomonas and Volvox, they move towards lower intensities of light or dim light. They move towards dim light, thereby exhibiting phototactic movement. Similarly, you can have chemotactic movement, which is a tactic movement which is in response to different types of chemicals. And lastly, we have thermotactic movement. Here, thermo implies temperature. So, thermotactic movement is the tactic movement in response to change in temperature. And the last point regarding tactic movement is that tactic movement bears no relation to the growth of the plant. It does not influence the growth of the plant in any way. Now, moving on to the second type of movement, which is tropic movement. Tropic movement is not a movement of locomotion, but it is a movement of curvature, which means to say that when a plant exhibits tropic movement, its body remains fixed in one place and only its different body parts will move. Now here, tropic movement, one of the defining characteristics of tropic movements is that the direction of movement or the response, which is in the form of movement, depends on the direction of the stimulus, which means to say that the response that is generated is influenced by the direction of the stimulus. So here we can say that the response is either towards the stimulus or away from the stimulus. Now here, tropic movement is exhibited by higher forms of plants, higher plants. The different types of tropic movements are phototropism. Here again, photo implies light. So phototropism is the tropic movement which is exhibited by plants in response to light. But however, since tropic movements can be either towards the stimulus or away from the stimulus, we can say that phototropism is either positive or negative, implying that positive phototropic movement or positive phototropism is the movement in towards light, and negative phototropism of negative phototropic movement is the movement away from light, which can be seen when you look at the different shoot system of the plant. The shoot system of the plant grows towards light or grows upwards. So we can say that the shoot system of the plant is positively phototropic. Similarly, the root of the plant, or the root system, grows away from the light. It grows into the soil away from the light. So the root system is negatively phototropic. Similarly, we have geotropism. Geo meaning either earth or gravity. So geotropism is the tropic movement exhibited by plants in response to soil or gravity. Here again, geotropism is either positive or negative. When the root system grows towards the soil and away from the light, it is said to exhibit positive geotropism. And similarly, the shoot system, which grows away from the soil towards the source of light, it exhibits negative geotropism as it grows away from the soil. Third is hydrotropism. Hydro implying water. So hydrotropism is a tropic movement exhibited by plants in response to water. Again, here we will be talking about the root system of the plant. The root system grows towards water. It moves towards water. So we can say that the root system shows or exhibits positive hydrotropism. And last but not least, we have chemotropism. Chemotropism, again, chemo implying chemicals, or chemotropism is the tropic movement in response to different types of chemicals. This can be exhibited, or this can be seen when the pollen grain germinates and lets out the pollen tube, which runs down the stigma of the flower into the ovary, into any one of the ovules. The pollen tube grows towards the ovary in response to certain chemicals that are present on the stigma, or that are present on the style, or within the style perhaps. So there we can say the pollen tube exhibits positive chemotropism because it moves towards the chemicals, and by doing so eventually it reaches the ovary of the flower. And one of the most important points regarding tropic movement is that tropic movement bears direct relation to the growth of the plant. It directly influences how the plant will grow. Which means to say that this movement brings about the growth of the plant. It influences the growth of the plant. Now last but not least, we are going to discuss Gnastic movement. Now Gnastic movement, like tropic movement, is a movement of curvature. It is not a movement of locomotion. However, unlike tropic movement, in Gnastic movement, the direction of the response or the direction of movement does not depend on the direction of the stimulus, which means to say that regardless of where the stimulus is arising, the plant, if it is sensitive to that stimulus, it will generate a response. And more importantly, the intensity of the stimulus will influence the intensity of the response. Now, again, Gnastic movement, like tropic movement, is exhibited by higher plants. Now, the different types of Gnastic movement are as follows. The first one is Phototactic. Phototactic is a Gnastic movement which is exhibited by plants in response to light. Now, here an example would be clover and oxalis. These two plants, during the day, their leaves expand horizontally and they remain that way during the day whenever there is plenty of sunlight. Now as evening approaches and slowly the intensity of the light goes down, these leaves will droop down slowly, exhibiting photonasty. The second type of Gnastic movement is thermonasty, which is a Gnastic movement in response to change in temperature. Here the example would be tulips. Now tulips, they will bloom in a certain range of temperature. If the temperature changes, they will stop blooming. So here tulips are said to show or exhibit thermonasty, a response to temperature or change in temperature. The third type of Gnastic movement is seismonasty. Now here seismo implies a shock or touch, right? So seismonasty is a Gnastic movement which is exhibited by plants in response to different types of stimuli like touch or shock. Now seismonasty can be exhibited by plants which we have already discussed before, which is Mimosa pudica, which is also known as touch me not plant. Now in this plant what happens is, whenever you touch the leaves of the plant, the leaves will slowly droop down or they will retract. And if you give it some time, the leaves will come back to its original position. So Mimosa pudica, or the touch me not plant, exhibits Chemonasty. And the last type of nastic movement that we are going to discuss is Chemonasty, which is a type of which is a nastic movement which is exhibited by plants in response to different types of chemicals. The example here would be the Venus flytrap. Now the Venus flytrap has its leaves in the form of a leaf blade. Now this leaf blade is sensitive to different types of chemicals. Different types of chemicals which are present naturally on the bodies of different insects. Now when these insects, they fly and they land on the leaf blade of the Venus flytrap, the plant senses those different types of chemicals and it responds by collapsing the two leaf blades, which collapse in on each other, trapping the insect and thereby allowing the plant to draw nutrition from the insect. So here we can see that the Venus flytrap exhibits Chemonasty. Now here too, one of the most important points to note about Gnastic movement is that Gnastic movement may occasionally influence growth, but it does not always influence growth like tropic movements. Now with that, we come to the end of the first part of this chapter, which is sensitivity and response in plants. And also, we come to the end of this lesson. I will thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.